The year is 1942. But here, in this small, damp room deep within the British Admiralty, time doesn't feel linear. It feels like a weight. The air is thick with the ghosts of failed ideas and the scent of cold tea and drying ink. On the walls, the entire northern coast of France is pinned up like a captured beast, a sprawling map dissected by red pencil lines that all bleed into the sea. This is the office of the Inter-Service Training and Development Center, a name so profoundly boring it could only be British military camouflage for a place where impossible questions are asked. And tonight, Commander Thomas Davies is staring at the most impossible question of all. He's a man built of tweed and naval tradition, with a mind as sharp as a ship's prow. For weeks, he and his team have been running the numbers, playing a grim war game on paper. The objective: land a modern army on a defended enemy beach. It is the central strategic problem of the entire war. The Prime Minister, Churchill, demands it. Stalin, bleeding in the east, begs for it. The Americans, now in the fight, are planning for it. An invasion is not a matter of if, but when. And Davies' job is to figure out how. He leans over his desk, the light from a single lamp carving his face out of the shadows. Before him lie the schematics for Britain's best landing craft. They are, in his professional opinion, magnificent vessels. Sturdy, steel-hulled boats, designed by the finest naval architects in the world. They are miniature marvels of the British Empire, capable of carrying men and machines across the notoriously violent English Channel. There is only one problem. A single, catastrophic, unfixable problem. He picks up his slide rule, its familiar weight cold in his hand, and runs the calculation for the 10th time that night, hoping the numbers will somehow lie, just this once. They don't. The Royal Navy's landing craft, like all proper ships, have deep drafts. They need several feet of water to operate, which means they will ground on sandbars 100, sometimes 200 yards from the shore. From there, the troops would have to disembark. They would step off a ramp into waist deep, sometimes chest deep, churning water. They would be laden with 60 pounds of gear, their rifles held high over their heads, wading slowly, clumsily, through the surf. Davies closes his eyes. He isn't seeing numbers anymore. He's seeing the beach. He's seeing the German intelligence reports, the pillboxes, the machine gun nests, the artillery positions zeroed in on the waterline. He can almost hear it, the sickening, metallic chatter of an MG-42, a weapon the Germans call Hitler's buzzsaw. In his mind's eye, the beautiful blue-gray of the channel turns a muddy, horrifying red. The waiting men are not soldiers. They are targets. Slow, exhausted, perfectly framed silhouettes, caught in a killing field with no cover, no retreat, and no hope. The plan, the one being whispered about in the highest echelons of power, wasn't just a bad plan. It was a mathematical formula for annihilation. He and his team had calculated the average time to wade ashore under fire, factored in the known density of German defenses, and arrived at a casualty projection. In the first 20 minutes, under expected resistance, the first wave would suffer 90% losses. It wasn't a risk. It was a hydraulic certainty. The plan wasn't a battle, it was the organized drowning of an army. The pride of the Royal Navy, the very ships meant to deliver liberation, would instead ferry an entire army to its grave. The official reports, the confident memoranda circulating through Whitehall, all spoke of overcoming the German defenses through sheer British grit and firepower. But Davies' calculations told a different story. They spoke of a brutal, bloody arithmetic that no amount of courage could solve. He pushes back from his desk, the chair scraping against the cold floor. He walks to the window, peering out through the blackout curtain at the veiled London night. The logic is inescapable. The tools they possessed made the task impossible. The entire Allied strategy for winning the war in Europe hinged on a cross-channel invasion. And a cross-channel invasion, with the ships they had, was suicide. It was like trying to knock down a brick wall by running at it with your head. You might be brave, you might be determined, but you will only ever break yourself against it. The anomaly wasn't on a radar screen or in a coded enemy transmission. It was right here, in this room, in the stark, simple physics of steel and water. The greatest amphibious force ever conceived was being designed to fail. And as he stood there, the weight of this terrible secret pressing down on him, the only question left was the one no one in high command seemed to be asking: how do you invade a fortress when the very ocean you must cross is the fortress's deadliest wall? The official explanation arrived 3 days later, not in a hushed conversation, but in the cold, oak-paneled grandeur of a strategy meeting at the Admiralty. The room was a shrine to naval power, dominated by a vast table polished to a mirror sheen, reflecting the grim faces of a dozen senior officers. At its head sat Admiral Sir Reginald Croft, a man whose spine seemed to have been forged from the same steel as the battleships he so dearly loved. He was the personification of the official story, a living monument to the belief that any problem could be solved with enough tonnage and gunpowder. Commander Davies stood before them, his report feeling impossibly thin in his hands. He laid out the brutal arithmetic he had discovered in the quiet of his office. He spoke of drafts and sandbars, of waiting times, and the horrifying efficiency of the MG-42. He presented the casualty projections not as a possibility, but as a certainty. When he finished, a chilling silence filled the room, thick and heavy. Admiral Croft broke it. He didn't look at Davies, he looked at the map of France on the wall, as if addressing the enemy personally. A sobering analysis. Commander, he began, his voice smooth and dismissive as polished marble. But it is an analysis of a problem in isolation. You've presented us with the strength of the lock. You have neglected to mention the force of the hammer we intend to bring to bear. And then came the plan. The comforting, logical, and fatally flawed assessment. It was a symphony of overwhelming force. A naval bombardment of unprecedented scale, turning the coastline to dust. A sky black with Lancaster and Halifax bombers, cratering every known German position. Entire flotillas of new, specialized assault ships bristling with rockets, designed to saturate the beaches with high explosives just moments before the first wave. The logic was clean, powerful, and deeply traditional. They would not ask the infantry to wade through a hail of fire, they would obliterate the fire before the first boot got wet. They would solve the problem not by changing the boat, but by leveling the entire battlefield from miles away. Davies's projections were politely shelved as a worst-case scenario. The system had encountered an anomaly, the terrifying vulnerability of its men, and had fit it neatly into a known box labeled target for naval ordnance. The meeting concluded. The official story was set in stone. The hammer would be bigger. Davies returned to his office, the Admiral's confident words echoing in his ears. It all sounded so perfect, so reassuring. But war wasn't clean. It was a chaotic, unpredictable beast. What if the bombers missed their targets in the morning mist? What if the naval guns, firing from miles out at sea, failed to silence a single, well-hidden machine gun nest? The entire plan rested on the arrogant assumption of perfection. If even one part of that hammer blow failed, the result would be the same: a beach turned into a butcher's yard. Dejected, he slumped into his chair. On the corner of his desk was a small pile of transatlantic mail, mostly dry logistical requests from Washington. He had a standing order with a junior liaison officer there to send along anything, no matter how trivial, that touched on American innovations in amphibious warfare. Most of it was useless technical papers. But today, underneath the usual stack, was a rolled-up magazine. It was a recent issue of Life. He almost tossed it aside, but the cover photo of American industry caught his eye. He thumbed through it idly, past articles on Hollywood and baseball, until a small, 2-page spread in the back stopped him cold. The headline was something about the Bayou boat builder. The photographs were grainy, black and white. They showed a strange-looking craft, squat and ugly, with a blunt nose and a ridiculously shallow hull. It wasn't made of proud British steel, the article said. It was mostly plywood and marine varnish. It wasn't built in a historic shipyard. It was churned out of a noisy, chaotic factory in New Orleans by a loud, cigar-chomping brute of a man named Andrew Jackson Higgins. The boat, the article explained, was designed to navigate the treacherous, log-infested swamps of Louisiana, to run right up onto muddy banks and deliver men and equipment to oil rigs. Then Davies saw the picture that changed everything. It showed the boat not in a swamp, but aimed at a sandy beach. Its blunt nose had dropped forward, forming a perfect ramp. And down this ramp, 24 fully equipped American soldiers were running onto dry sand. They weren't waiting. They weren't struggling. They were a torrent of instant, lethal force, delivered directly from the sea to the shore. The boat's name was the Eureka. Davies stared, his mind racing. This cheap, ugly, plywood thing. It didn't need the beach to be obliterated. It didn't care about sandbars. It treated the water's edge not as an obstacle, but as a destination. It rendered the deadliest 100 yards of the battlefield irrelevant. It wasn't a ship. It was a key, designed for the specific lock that Croft and the Admiralty were convinced could only be smashed with a hammer. He read the article again, his fingers tracing the outline of the boat. The official explanation, so confident and powerful in the Admiralty boardroom, suddenly looked not just wrong, but fatally naive. It was a plan to fight the last war. This plywood ark from a Louisiana swamp. This was the tool to win the next one. The contradiction was absolute. The best minds in the British Empire were designing ever more powerful hammers, while a maverick inventor across the ocean had quietly, almost accidentally, handed them the one thing they truly needed. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that showing this magazine to Admiral Croft would be career suicide. It was an insult to a century of naval tradition. But the image of those soldiers running on dry sand was burned into his mind. He pulled a secure message pad towards him and began to write a clandestine cable, bypassing the entire Admiralty chain of command. It was not addressed to an admiral or a general. It was addressed to his liaison officer in Washington, D.C. The message was short, and for a man of his station, utterly insane. It contained a single, urgent request: find out everything you can about the boats made by a man named Higgins. The memo from Washington arrived 2 weeks later, tucked inside a diplomatic pouch to avoid the prying eyes of the Admiralty. It wasn't a formal report. It was a single, typed page, smelling faintly of American tobacco, from the attaché Davies had cabled. It confirmed everything the Life magazine article had hinted at, but with the cold, hard data of a military observer. The Higgins boat, officially designated the Landing Craft, Personnel Large, or LCPL, was a joke by Royal Navy standards. It was unarmored. It was noisy. Its single diesel engine was prone to fouling. And it was made, for the most part, of wood. But the memo ended with a paragraph that made Davies's blood run cold with excitement. In recent trials with the U.S. Marine Corps, the boat had achieved a fully loaded draft of less than 3 feet. It could maintain its top speed of 12 knots in choppy seas and, most critically, could run its flat bottom directly onto a gently sloping beach until the keel bit into the sand. It could effectively beach itself in 18 inches of water. 18 inches. That wasn't a wade. That was a puddle. This was the moment the mystery of the beaches transformed from an academic problem into a strategic emergency. Davies grabbed a map of the Normandy coast, the one the planners were already starting to favor for the invasion. He laid his slide rule against the tidal charts and gradient measurements painstakingly gathered by spies and reconnaissance flights. The numbers aligned with a terrifying clarity. The entire German coastal defense strategy, what Allied intelligence called the Atlantic Wall, was predicated on a single, fundamental assumption that an invading force would be at its most vulnerable in the last 100 yards of water. The placement of every machine gun nest, the angle of every anti-tank ditch, the pre-sighted coordinates for every artillery battery, all were designed to turn that shallow surf into a perfect, interlocking field of fire. It was a brilliant strategy. Think of it like a medieval castle. The Germans had built a towering wall the French coast. They had dug a deep, deadly moat the English Channel. But they knew the real killing ground was the shallow water right before the castle wall, where attackers in heavy armor would be slow, exposed, and struggling to gain their footing. They had filled that moat's edge with archers, boiling oil, and everything they had. The Higgins boat didn't try to swim the moat. It didn't try to drain it. It was the strategic equivalent of a magical bridge that could appear out of nowhere and span the deadliest part, depositing knights directly at the base of the wall, ready to fight. If the Allies could acquire these boats, and this was the crucial part, acquire them in secret, they could turn the Germans' greatest strength into their most catastrophic weakness. They would be defending a part of the battlefield the Allies had no intention of fighting on. The entire, elaborate defensive system would be facing the wrong way, aimed at a phantom army struggling in the waves, while the real army was already sprinting up the beach behind a curtain of spray. The stakes were no longer about casualty figures. This was about the viability of the entire war. A failed invasion would not just be a defeat, it would be the end. It would cede all of Europe to Hitler, perhaps permanently. It would validate the Admiralty's flawed plan and shatter Allied morale. With the Soviets showing signs of strain on the Eastern Front, a catastrophic failure in France could fracture the Grand Alliance and lead to a negotiated peace that would leave the Nazi regime in power. Everything, the fate of France, the future of Britain, the very concept of a free Europe rested on getting tens of thousands of men onto those beaches in the first 30 minutes. This ugly, plywood boat wasn't just a tactical advantage. It was the linchpin. Without it, the invasion was a massacre waiting to happen. With it, they had a real, tangible chance to unhinge the entire German war machine. Davies stood in his office, the quiet hum of London a distant murmur. He felt a profound sense of isolation. He held a truth that could win the war, but it was a truth his own superiors were structurally incapable of seeing. He was a naval officer in an institution that had measured its strength in cannons and armor plating for 300 years. Proposing an invasion built on a foundation of plywood would be seen as heresy. Admiral Croft and the others aren't fools. They were simply blinded by tradition, by the magnificent, outdated logic of the battleship. There was no more time for memos or polite suggestions. The clock was ticking. Factories in Britain were already beginning to tool up for the production of the Royal Navy's flawed steel landing craft, burning precious time and resources. He had to get one of those Higgins boats here, to England, where he could prove its worth in a way no report ever could. He had to force the Admiralty to see. He reached for his secure phone, the direct line to the cabinet war rooms. He was about to commit a breathtaking act of insubordination, to go over the heads of his entire command structure and appeal to the one man in the country who might understand a radical, unorthodox idea when he saw one, the Prime Minister himself. He took a deep breath, knowing his career was now measured in hours. He was no longer a planner. He was a conspirator. The mission was no longer to write reports. The mission was to steal the key to Fortress Europe from a swamp boat builder in New Orleans, smuggle it across the Atlantic, and launch a one-man invasion of the British Admiralty. The first clue to how this secret war would be won arrived not in a diplomatic pouch, but crated up like common cargo on the grimy deck of a Lend-Lease freighter. It was early 1943. After weeks of clandestine maneuvering, leveraging a half-forgotten connection in the Ministry of Supply, and burning every ounce of political capital he had, Davies had succeeded. Churchill's office, intrigued by the sheer audacity of the request, had sanctioned the emergency acquisition of American Lightridge prototypes for evaluation. 2 weeks later, a single, brand-new LCVP, the newest evolution of Higgins's Eureka boat, now with a fully integrated bow ramp, was winched onto a dock in Southampton under the cloak of a foggy dawn. To the dockworkers, it was just another piece of American machinery. To Davies and the small, hand-picked team of junior officers he'd assembled, it was the Rosetta Stone. They swarmed over it in the gray morning light, their initial reaction a mixture of awe and profound disappointment. The thing was offensively crude. The welds on the steel ramp were thick and uneven. The plywood sides felt alarmingly thin, capable of being breached by a bayonet, let alone a machine gun. The cockpit was a Spartan affair of simple levers and a large, brutish-looking compass. It smelled not of salt and tradition, but of fresh paint, diesel, and sawdust. An older naval engineer Davies had brought along, a man who worshipped at the altar of riveted steel, ran a hand along the plywood hull and muttered, "My God, it's a bloody coffin." But Davies saw the genius in its simplicity. It wasn't built to last for 30 years, it was built to last for 30 minutes, the most important 30 minutes of the war. It was a disposable delivery system, an assault vehicle designed with the ruthless, unsentimental logic of a bullet. Its value wasn't in its durability, but in its geometry. The real discovery, the first electrifying clue, came when they got it in the water. They chose a secluded stretch of coastline in Dorset, a place of shingle beaches and chalky cliffs that bore a passing resemblance to the Normandy coast. A young sub-lieutenant, a former yacht racer chosen for his intuitive feel for small craft, was at the helm. Davies stood beside him, clutching the rails as the gray marine diesel engine roared to life with a shockingly loud, unmuffled bellow. The boat moved with a nimbleness that defied its boxy appearance. It didn't cut through the waves like a proper naval vessel, it skated over them, its flat bottom slapping the water with a percussive rhythm. They brought it up to speed, and the young helmsman began to grin. This wasn't a ship, it was a speedboat. It could turn on a dime, responding with an immediacy that their own landing craft, heavy and ponderous, could never match. This was a crucial discovery. It wasn't just a transport, it was an elusive target. Then came the moment of truth. "All right, petty officer," Davies said, his voice tight. "Take her in. Straight for the beach." The sub-lieutenant pushed the throttle forward. The engine screamed. The shingle beach rushed towards them at an alarming rate. The naval engineer from the dock closed his eyes, bracing for the bone-jarring crash he knew was coming. Even Davies felt a knot of fear tighten in his stomach. Every instinct, every year of training, screamed that what they were about to do was wrong. You don't drive a boat onto the land. But the Higgins boat didn't crash. There was a low, grating shudder as the flat bottom made contact with the submerged shingle, a sound like a giant dragging a heavy wooden crate across gravel. The boat slid forward, its momentum carrying it up the gentle slope, rising out of the water like some prehistoric creature crawling from the sea. It came to a halt with a final, decisive jolt. The water around them wasn't at their waists. It was barely over their ankles. Davies gave a nod. Two of his men in the hold threw the levers for the bow ramp. With a crash of steel on stone, the gateway to Europe slammed down onto the beach. It formed a perfect, solid bridge. For a moment, everyone was silent. They were aground, yes, but they were aground exactly where they wanted to be. They had breached the wall. This was the first great revelation, the feeling of holding a tangible piece of the answer. All the reports, all the numbers, all the theories, they were real. The plywood arc worked. A wave of triumphant optimism washed over Davies. He felt like an archaeologist who had just unearthed a key that fit a lock no one had been able to open for 1,000 years. The path forward seemed so clear now. He would film these trials. He would document the performance data. He would present this irrefutable proof to the Admiralty, and they would have no choice but to see the truth. The sheer, self-evident brilliance of the design would sweep away all opposition. He allowed himself a rare smile, watching his men walk down the ramp onto the dry shingle. He thought, for a fleeting moment, that the hardest part of his battle was over. He had his proof. He had found the key. He had no idea that finding the key was the easy part. The real fight, the battle against centuries of dogma, against the pride of an empire, and against the crushing inertia of a military machine already grinding in the wrong direction, was just about to begin. The film reel flickered in the darkened Admiralty conference room, the clattering of the projector the only sound. On the screen, the ugly plywood boat performed its impossible trick again and again. It charged the Dorset beach, slammed down its ramp, and disgorged a platoon of Royal Marines who sprinted onto dry land in under 10 seconds. The footage was raw, undeniable, and utterly convincing. Commander Davies stood at the side of the room, his heart pounding with the certainty of a man who has just laid a royal flush on the table. This was his irrefutable proof. When the lights came up, the silence that followed was not one of awed contemplation. It was the icy, hostile silence of an old man's club whose traditions have just been publicly insulted. Admiral Croft sat at the head of the table, his fingers steepled, his face an unreadable mask of aristocratic disdain. He didn't look at the screen, he looked directly at Davies. "An interesting exhibition, Commander," Croft began, his voice dangerously soft. "You've demonstrated that this American barge can indeed run itself aground with some enthusiasm. A trait it shares with most vessels helmed by an incompetent." A few nervous chuckles echoed from the senior officers. Davies felt a chill creep up his spine. This wasn't going the way he'd planned. "Sir," Davies started, trying to keep his voice steady, "the point is not the seamanship. The point is the tactical advantage. It neutralizes the kill zone in the surf. It delivers men directly, it delivers men in an unarmored wooden box." "Commander," another admiral interjected, a man whose family had been building ships of the line since Nelson's day. "A box that would be shredded by a single well-placed machine gun. We have intelligence confirming the Germans are fortifying the coast with 75mm anti-tank guns. What, precisely, is your plywood marvel's tactical response to an armor-piercing shell?" The attack had begun. The promising lead, the beautiful, simple solution, was being systematically dismantled not by enemy action, but by the intellectual immune system of the institution he served. It wasn't just a dead end, it was an ambush. For the next hour, they picked it apart. The boat was too loud, the Germans would hear it from miles away. It was too small, it would be swamped in the notoriously violent Channel Chop. Its engine was American-made, a logistical nightmare to maintain with British parts. Its construction was flimsy, an insult to the proud traditions of the Royal Navy's shipyards. They weren't seeing a key to a strategic problem. They were seeing a threat to their entire way of thinking. This boat was an admission that their own designs, their own theories of amphibious warfare, were fundamentally wrong. It was a vote of no confidence in British engineering, British seamanship, and British tradition. And then came the enemy's genius, not Hitler's, but the genius of institutional inertia. Admiral Croft delivered the killing blow. He didn't argue with Davies's data. He simply absorbed it into his own, grander vision. Let us assume, for the sake of argument, that this Higgins craft has some limited, specialized utility, Croft said, waving a dismissive hand. A sideshow. The core of our assault will be, and must be, centered on vessels of substance. Our new landing craft, tank steel vessels, armed with their own support cannon, capable of delivering our armored divisions directly. The plan remains the same. We will not sneak ashore in little wooden boats, Commander. We will crush the Atlantic Wall with the full might of the Royal Navy and the British Army. Your enthusiasm for this American novelty is noted, but it is a distraction from the main effort. It was a masterstroke of bureaucratic warfare. He wasn't rejecting the boat, he was trivializing it, relegating it to a footnote. He was flipping the chessboard over. Davies had come to offer a new strategy, and Croft had reframed it as a mere tactical gimmick. The film, the data, the irrefutable proof, it all vanished, absorbed by the sheer, immovable mass of the established plan. Davies was no longer a visionary, he was a gadfly, a minor annoyance buzzing around the heads of great men planning a great enterprise. He left the meeting in a state of cold fury. His promising lead hadn't just fizzled out, it had been weaponized against him. He had shown them the key, and they had declared it to be a cheap trinket, preferring to stick with their conviction that the only way through the door was to knock down the entire wall. He had underestimated his opponent. He thought he was fighting a tactical problem, but he was actually fighting a culture. The Admiralty wasn't an organization, it was a faith, and he was a heretic. As he walked back to his office under a gray, drizzling sky, he realized the terrifying truth. They weren't just ignoring him. They were actively working to bury his discovery. The production orders for their own flawed, deep-draft landing craft were being expedited. The window to change course was closing, slammed shut by the very men he was trying to save. He wasn't a hunter on the trail of a solution. He was the hunted, and the entire weight of the British military establishment was closing in. The weeks that followed the disastrous Admiralty meeting were the bleakest of Davies's career. He was a ghost in the halls of power, politely ostracized. Memos went unanswered. Requests for resources were mysteriously lost in bureaucratic channels. The official plan, Admiral Croft's grand symphony of steel and firepower, rolled forward with the unstoppable momentum of a glacier, crushing all dissent beneath it. The Higgins boat, his beautiful, simple solution, was locked away under a tarpaulin in the Dorset boatyard, a forgotten piece of evidence from a trial that had already been decided. The fog of war, he was discovering, wasn't just on the battlefield its thickest, most suffocating banks were right here, in the corridors of Whitehall. Just as he was beginning to succumb to despair, the breakthrough came. And as is so often the case in the tangled business of war, it came not from a grand strategic maneuver, but from a quiet conversation in an unexpected quarter. The source was a man named Geoffrey Pike, a civilian scientist and inventor attached to Combined Operations Headquarters. Pike was a genuine eccentric, a gangly figure with a wild mane of hair and a mind that operated in a dimension entirely separate from the military establishment. He was a man famous for proposing to build aircraft carriers out of ice. He was brilliant, unorthodox, and universally distrusted by men like Admiral Croft. He was, in short, the perfect ally. Pike had heard whispers of Davies's plywood folly, and, intrigued by any idea the Admiralty hated on principle, sought him out. He found Davies brooding over title charts in a forgotten corner of the War Office library. Pike didn't care about naval tradition or the aesthetics of shipbuilding. He was a man of pure, brutal logic. They say your boat is made of wood and will be shredded, Pike began, without preamble, peering at Davies over a pair of thick spectacles. This is, of course, true, but it is also irrelevant. They are analyzing the problem from the wrong end. They are asking, how do we build a boat that can survive a machine gun bullet? Which is a fool's errand. The question we should be asking is, how do we put so many boats on the water that the machine gunners cannot possibly shoot them all? It was a stunningly simple, radical shift in perspective. Pike wasn't talking about boat design, he was talking about mathematics. The War College briefing that unfolded in that dusty library corner wasn't about tactics, it was about the cold, hard calculus of mass production. Imagine, Pike explained, you're trying to cross a field defended by a single archer. If you send one knight in heavy, expensive, perfectly crafted armor, the archer has one target. He can take his time, aim for a weak spot in the visor, and there's a good chance he'll succeed. This was the Admiralty's plan: a few, perfect, expensive steel landing craft. But what if, instead, you send 100 unarmored peasants, each carrying only a pitchfork, and tell them to sprint across the field all at once? The archer can only shoot one arrow at a time. He might kill 1, 2, maybe even 10, but 90 will get across. The peasants are individually weak, but collectively overwhelming. The Higgins boat, Pike argued, was the peasant. It was cheap. It was made of non-strategic materials like plywood. Most importantly, it was designed for mass production on a scale the traditional shipyards could never dream of. The Admiralty thinks this is a duel between knights, Pike insisted, his eyes alight with intellectual fire. It is not. It is a war between factories. And the factory that can produce the most threats per hour will win. Your boat isn't a weapon, it is an expendable, mass-produced threat. This was the breakthrough. Davies had been arguing for the boat's tactical superiority. Pike had given him the language to argue for its strategic necessity. The plan isn't to replace the Admiralty's craft, it was to supplement them, to drown the German defenses in sheer, unbelievable numbers. They could afford to lose 100 Higgins boats, even 200, if it meant that thousands of men got ashore in the first 10 minutes. It was a brutal, industrial-age solution to an industrial-age problem. The value of the boat wasn't its individual strength, but its collective, expendable nature. Armed with this new, electrifying logic, Davies knew what he had to do. This wasn't a naval matter anymore. This was a question of industrial capacity, of logistics, of grand strategy. There was only one organization that thought in those terms, an organization that Pike had a direct line to Combined Operations Headquarters, the brainchild of Lord Louis Mountbatten. Mountbatten was royalty, a cousin to the king, but he was also a pragmatist, a brilliant and sometimes ruthless innovator tasked with shaking up the rigid thinking of the established services. He was everything Admiral Croft was not. Davies and Pike spent the next 48 hours drafting a new proposal. It wasn't about boat design, it was a logistical plan. It was filled with production figures, shipping tonnages, and a devastating cost-benefit analysis that showed how, for the price of one of the Admiralty's steel landing craft, they could have 20 of Higgins's plywood arcs. They were no longer peddling a boat. They were proposing a new doctrine of amphibious assault, built on the American industrial principle of mass-produced, disposable quantity. The new, more dangerous path forward was clear. They would bypass the Admiralty entirely and take their case directly to the one man who had the power, the vision, and the royal authority to make it happen. The meeting with Lord Mountbatten took place not in a stuffy Admiralty boardroom, but in the controlled chaos of Combined Operations Headquarters, a place that hummed with the energy of a university laboratory crossed with a pirate ship. Maps covered every wall, strange prototypes of weapons sat in corners, and the air crackled with a sense of urgent, irreverent purpose. Mountbatten, handsome and impossibly charismatic, listened to Davies and Pike with an unnerving intensity, his eyes darting from their faces to the production charts they had prepared. He didn't interrupt. He simply absorbed the information, his mind, a famously quick instrument, assembling the pieces. When they finished, he stood and walked to a vast, wall-sized map of the English Channel and the French coast. For a long moment, he said nothing, tracing the coastline with a single finger. "Gentlemen," he said finally, turning back to them, "you have not brought me a boat. You have brought me a mathematical solution to an unsolvable equation." He understood. He saw the cold, brutal logic of Pike's peasant rush. He saw the industrial genius of Higgins. He saw the catastrophic flaw in the Admiralty's thinking. Within a week, things began to move with a speed that was terrifying. Leveraging his authority and his direct line to Churchill, Mountbatten acted. A formal request, citing urgent operational requirements for Overlord, was sent to the American War Production Board. The request was not for a few prototypes for evaluation. It was for 1,200 Higgins boats, with an option for thousands more. The American industrial machine, already running at full throttle, began to churn them out. But as the first reports of this massive procurement order filtered back through the labyrinthine channels of the British military, Davies found himself facing a new, more dangerous enemy. He had gone around the Admiralty. He had challenged their authority, questioned their competence, and, with Mountbatten's backing, he had won. Now, he was about to discover the price of that victory. The truth he had unearthed was not merely inconvenient, it was a profound institutional humiliation. The uncomfortable truth was this: the Royal Navy, the most powerful and prestigious naval force in the world for over 3 centuries, had failed. They had failed to design the single most important piece of equipment for the single most important operation of the war. They had been outthought, out-innovated, and outmaneuvered, not by the Germans, but by a maverick boat builder from the swamps of Louisiana. Their magnificent, steel-hulled landing craft, the product of the finest naval architects in the empire, were now exposed as little more than expensive, elegant death traps. This wasn't just a disagreement over tactics. It was a dagger pointed at the heart of their identity. And the Admiralty was not an institution that took kindly to being told it was wrong, especially by one of its own junior officers and a wild-eyed civilian scientist. The victory at Combined Operations HQ was not the end of the war, it was the beginning of a bureaucratic insurgency. Davies began to feel the chill. He was summoned to a debriefing with Admiral Croft. It wasn't a shouting match. It was far worse. It was a cold, surgical dissection of his career. Croft sat behind his enormous desk, a file open before him. He spoke of loyalty, of the chain of command, of the proper channels for dissent. He didn't raise his voice. He simply laid out, with the detached precision of a hangman, how Davies's actions constituted a grave breach of protocol and trust. "You have, Commander," Croft said, his voice dripping with condescension, "in your zeal, forgotten your place. You have bypassed your superiors. You have aligned yourself with irregulars and championed a foreign design of dubious quality. You have created a logistical nightmare and sown discord at a critical juncture in our planning." The message was clear. Davies had broken the code. He had committed the unforgivable sin of being right in a way that made his superiors look wrong. The system was now mobilizing to protect itself. The uncomfortable truth isn't that the Higgins boat was the answer. The uncomfortable truth, for the men who ran the Royal Navy, was that one of their own had exposed their collective failure to the highest levels of government. And for that, there would have to be a reckoning. The system pushed back not with a bang, but with the quiet, suffocating force of a rising tide. The Admiralty, having lost the strategic argument in Mountbatten's office, now shifted the battle to a field where they were undisputed masters of the labyrinth of logistics and implementation. They could no longer stop the Higgins boats from coming, but they could, with 1,000 subtle cuts, ensure they were never properly integrated into the invasion plan. It was a bureaucratic masterpiece of passive resistance. First came the unforeseen complications with shipping. Suddenly, the transatlantic convoys were filled to capacity with higher priority material. The Higgins boats, designated LCVPs, were left sitting on the docks in New Orleans and Norfolk for weeks, waiting for available deck space. When they finally did arrive in Britain, they were often offloaded at inconvenient ports, far from the designated training areas, leading to massive delays in transport. Next came the problem of technical compatibility. The Admiralty's engineers produced a flurry of reports, each one highlighting a new, critical flaw. The American diesel engines, they claimed, required a grade of fuel that was in short supply. The ramp mechanisms were supposedly prone to jamming if exposed to the grit of British beaches. The plywood hulls, they warned with grave concern, were susceptible to a previously unknown species of marine borer found only in the English Channel. Each report was a masterpiece of plausible denial, a carefully constructed fiction designed to sow doubt and create delay. Davies found himself spending his days not planning for the invasion, but writing furious countermemos, chasing down fuel specifications, and debunking phantom marine worms. Then came the direct orders. Admiral Croft, with a veneer of magnanimous compromise, declared that while the LCVPs would be used, they would be relegated to secondary roles. They would transport supplies in the later waves, or act as ship-to-shore ferries for personnel behind the main assault. The critical first wave, the tip of the spear, would still be carried in the Royal Navy's own steel-hulled landing craft assault LCAs, the very boats Davies had proven were death traps. The official plan, the one Davies had fought so hard to change, was reasserting itself through the sheer, brute force of the chain of command. Davies was formally ordered to cease his independent advocacy for the American craft and to focus his efforts on integrating the LCAs into the assault plan. He was being silenced, co-opted into the very failure he had tried to prevent. The report he and Pike had written for Mountbatten was classified at the highest level and buried in an archive, effectively erasing the intellectual foundation of their victory. The system wasn't just pushing back, it was rewriting history in real time. The final, most crushing blow came in the form of a new posting. Commander Thomas Davies was to be transferred, effective immediately. He was not being demoted or court-martialed, that would be too obvious, too crude. Instead, he was being promoted. He was assigned to a senior staff position at the naval base in Scapa Flow, Scotland. On paper, it was a prestigious command, a recognition of his talents. In reality, it was a gilded cage. Scapa Flow was the home of the British Home Fleet, a bastion of traditional battleship power, and the place where ambitious careers went to die a slow, quiet death. It was as far from the English Channel, as far from the invasion planning, as far from the war itself, as it was possible to get within the British Isles. He was being exiled. He had brought the Admiralty an uncomfortable truth, and now they were making him disappear, sending him to the frozen north to contemplate his insubordination among the gray, silent dreadnoughts of a bygone era. The message was unequivocal: the system would tolerate innovation, but it would not tolerate heresy. The heretic had been cast out, and the invasion of Europe would now proceed along the lines, and with the boats, that Admiral Croft had decreed. Scapa Flow was a purgatory of gray water and endless sky. For months, Davies walked the windy shores, watching the great, steel beasts of the home fleet swing at their moorings, dinosaurs waiting for a battle that would never come. He was a commander with nothing to command, a planner with nothing to plan. Mail from the south was infrequent and heavily censored. He was cut off, isolated, a man forced to watch the horizon while the fate of the world was being decided hundreds of miles away. His crusade was over. He had lost. The crushing weight of that failure was a physical presence, a cold companion on his lonely walks. He pictured the faces of the young soldiers he had seen in training, men who would soon be ordered to wade into the surf from the ramps of the Admiralty's steel boats, and felt a profound, sickening sense of guilt. He had seen the cliff edge, he had warned them, and they were going to drive over it anyway. This was the absolute bottom. The great machine of Overlord was grinding inexorably towards its launch date, set for early June 1944, and it was grinding forward with the Admiralty's flawed, fatal plan still at its core. Davies's warnings, Pike's mathematics, Mountbatten's intervention, it had all been for nothing, a small eddy swept away by the immense current of institutional pride. The thousands of Higgins boats arriving from America were a logistical footnote, piling up in storage depots, their revolutionary potential neutered by bureaucratic inertia. Then, in the late spring, a single, cryptic letter arrived. It was from a junior American officer, a naval liaison he had worked with briefly in London. The envelope bore a U.S. Army post office mark. The letter itself was cheerful, innocuous, filled with chatter about the weather and the terrible quality of English beer. But tucked into the final paragraph was a single, electrifying sentence: "It seems your old boss, the Admiral, is not the only one with friends in high places. The view from the top is quite different, you know." Davies read the line a dozen times. The view from the top. It could only mean one person: the Supreme Allied Commander himself, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Unbeknownst to Davies, a parallel battle had been raging within the highest echelons of SHEF, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. The American generals, men like Omar Bradley, were products of a different military culture. They were pragmatists, not traditionalists. They had seen the reports from amphibious landings in the Pacific, brutal affairs that had taught them the value of speed and mass over armor and prestige. They had seen the casualty figures from landings where troops had to wade ashore. When they saw the Higgins boat, they didn't see an insult to naval tradition, they saw a tool that worked. Eisenhower, tasked with the ultimate responsibility for millions of lives, was a man obsessed with logistics and the brutal realities of the battlefield. He had listened to the British Admiralty's confident presentations, but he had also listened to his own commanders on the ground. He had reviewed the after-action reports from the Pacific. He had seen the films from Davies's Dorset trials, which Mountbatten, in a final, brilliant act of bureaucratic sabotage, had ensured made their way into the American briefing packets. The disaster Davies had tried to prevent was now set in motion, but the motion itself had finally caught the attention of the one man who could stop it. In a series of tense, closed-door meetings in late spring, Eisenhower and his staff had done the unthinkable. They had overruled the British Admiralty. Citing his authority as Supreme Commander, Eisenhower had issued a directive. The primary assault craft for the American sectors of the invasion, the beaches codenamed Utah and Omaha, would not be the British LCA. It would be the American LCVP, the Higgins boat. The decision was a political earthquake, but it was made. The Admiralty, furious but impotent, was forced to comply. Their authority superseded. They retained control over the British and Canadian beaches, where their own LCAs would still, tragically, be used. But for the two American beaches, where the fighting was expected to be heaviest, the plywood arc would carry the first wave. Davies knew none of this. He only knew that a great and terrible event was about to unfold. Standing on the cliffs of Orkney, listening to the cry of the gulls, he felt utterly helpless. The date June 5th, then postponed to June 6th, came and went. He waited, like the rest of the world, listening to the crackle of the BBC radio for news. He had failed. He had been exiled. And the largest amphibious invasion in the history of warfare, the event he had dedicated his life to shaping, was now irrevocably underway without him. The price of truth, he thought, was to be left behind in the dark. The news from Normandy trickled into Scapa Flow in fragmented, chaotic bursts. First, the official BBC broadcasts, stiff and formal, announcing that Allied forces had successfully landed on the coast of France. Then came the whispers, the rumors that spread like wildfire through the naval base, fragmented signals intelligence, frantic messages between ships, the raw, unfiltered chatter of the battle. Davies, using what little authority he had left, practically lived in the communications center, piecing together a horrifying mosaic of the unfolding catastrophe. The British and Canadian beaches Gold, Juno, and Sword were a brutal, bloody fight. The reports confirmed Davies's worst fears. The steel-hulled LCAs, just as he had predicted, grounded on sandbars dozens of yards from the shore. The troops were forced to disembark into a churning, waist-deep sea, just as the Germans had planned. They were cut down in horrifying numbers by machine gun and mortar fire as they struggled through the surf. The casualty rates in the initial waves were staggering, a terrible price paid for the Admiralty's pride. It was a victory, yes, but one bought with a torrent of blood that could have, and should have, been spared. Davies listened to the casualty estimates with the sick, hollow feeling of a Cassandra whose prophecies had come true in the most tragic way imaginable. But it was the news from the American sectors that was truly apocalyptic. At Utah Beach, the landings had gone surprisingly well. A fortuitous current had pushed the assault waves south of their intended target, onto a stretch of beach that was far less heavily defended. Here, the Higgins boats performed flawlessly, racing over the sandbars, dropping their ramps on dry or near-dry sand, and unleashing a flood of men who were able to establish a beachhead with remarkable speed and relatively light losses. It was the Dorset trials writ large, a stunning validation of the entire concept. Then there was Omaha. The reports from Omaha Beach were not of a battle. They were of a massacre. A veteran German infantry division, missed by Allied intelligence, was dug into the bluffs overlooking the shore. The pre-invasion bombardment had been a complete failure, barely scratching the German defenses. The tide was higher than anticipated, the surf more violent. Into this perfectly prepared killing field came the first wave of American soldiers. They came in Higgins' boats. Davies listened, his knuckles white, as the story unfolded over the wireless. He heard of LCVPs shredded by artillery before they even reached the beach. He heard of ramps dropping to expose every man inside to a wall of machine gun fire. He heard of boats swamped by the waves, drowning their entire complements of men. The plywood coffins, the cheap, disposable craft, they were being annihilated. The beaches were a charnel house, the water crimson. For a moment, it seemed the Admiralty had been right. The unarmored boats were a suicidal folly. The American beachhead at Omaha was on the verge of total collapse. Davies felt a crushing despair. Had he been wrong? Had he sent these men to their deaths in flimsy wooden boxes, trading one kind of slaughter for another? But then, as the day wore on, a different story began to emerge from the chaos. It wasn't a story of design, but of numbers and sheer, desperate courage. Yes, dozens of LCVPs were destroyed, but there were so many of them. For every boat that was hit, 2, 3, 4 more made it through the wall of fire. They didn't stop. The coxswains, many of them teenage civilians from the Coast Guard Reserve, drove their flimsy craft with suicidal bravery, threading them through obstacles and shell splashes, ramming them onto the narrow strip of shingle at the water's edge. They found tiny gaps in the storm of steel, and though many boats were lost, the ramps of the survivors dropped, and men dazed, terrified, but alive and on their feet got out. They didn't have to wait. They were able to sprint the few yards to the minimal cover of the seawall. It was Pike's brutal mathematics playing out in real time. The peasant rush. Hundreds of boats, thousands of men, hitting the beach in a continuous, unstoppable flood. The German defenders, for all their firepower, were simply overwhelmed. They could not shoot fast enough. The individual boat was fragile, but the wave was unbreakable. By midday, against all odds, small groups of American soldiers had clawed their way off the beach and up the bluffs. By nightfall, the beachhead at Omaha, bought at an almost unspeakable cost, was secure. The plywood ark, in its final, most terrible test, had not failed. It had delivered just enough men to the one place they needed to be, turning the tide of the battle, and the war, through its The year is 1964. 20 years have passed since the landings. The world has been remade. Commander Thomas Davies, now Captain Davies, retired, is an old man. His hair is white, his face a roadmap of lines carved by sea salt and memory. He lives in a small cottage on the Dorset coast, not far from the shingle beach where he first watched the Higgins boat perform its impossible trick. The war for him is not a grand, heroic memory. It is a quiet, persistent ache, a ghost of what-ifs and the faces of men he never knew but felt he had failed. His exile to Scapa Flow had lasted until the end of the war. He had been quietly decorated, honorably retired, and effectively erased from the official narrative of Overlord. The Admiralty's histories, when they mentioned the landing craft at all, praised the gallantry of the crews and the sturdiness of the British-made LCAs, glossing over the brutal arithmetic of their design. The Higgins boat was a footnote, an American curiosity. One gray afternoon, a package arrives. It has an American postmark and the return address of a university history department. Inside is a book, a thick new volume titled Cross-Channel Attack, part of the U.S. Army's official history of the Second World War. A letter is tucked inside the cover, from a young, persistent historian who had tracked him down. The letter explained that a vast trove of documents from SHAF headquarters had recently been declassified. Among them, the historian wrote, were the minutes of a series of highly contentious planning meetings from the spring of 1944. With trembling hands, Davies opens the book. The historian has marked a page. It is a direct transcript of a meeting between General Eisenhower and his senior staff. The topic is the choice of landing craft for the American beaches. Davies reads the words of General Omar Bradley, who is quoted verbatim, "Our simulations, based largely on British data from the Dorset trials, are unequivocal. Using the standard British LCA will result in an estimated 60 to 70 casualty rate in the first wave before our men can even fire a shot. They will be wading into perfectly sighted machine gun fire. It is not a battle plan, it is an execution order." Davies stops, his breath catching in his throat. The Dorset trials, his work, his films, his reports, they hadn't been buried. Mountbatten had gotten them to the Americans. He reads on. The transcript details the fierce opposition from the Royal Navy liaisons, who argued for uniformity of equipment and praised the proven seaworthiness of their own craft. Then comes the decisive moment. The final speaker quoted is Eisenhower himself. I don't give a damn about uniformity. The Supreme Commander's voice snaps from the page, cold and clear across 2 decades. I care about getting my boys ashore. The data is clear. The British craft are fighting the water. This Higgins boat fights the beach. We're going with Higgins. That's an order. Davies closes the book, his eyes stinging. The room is silent, save for the cry of gulls outside his window. For 20 years, he had believed he had failed. He had believed his warnings had gone unheard, that his battle had been lost in the corridors of the Admiralty. But here it was, in black and white, pulled from a declassified file deep in a Washington archive. The truth. He hadn't failed. He had succeeded in the only way that mattered. His heresy, his insubordination, his alliance with the eccentric Pike, his desperate appeal to Mountbatten, it had all formed a chain that reached across the Atlantic and into the hands of the one man with the power to change the outcome. And in that single, decisive order, the fate of Omaha Beach was sealed. The thousands of young men who would storm that shore would do so in plywood boats. Many would die, but enough would make it across the sand to win the day. Davies hadn't just been proven right, he had, without ever knowing it, given the men on the deadliest beach in Normandy a fighting chance. The declassified file did not just vindicate him. It revealed the secret, internal battle that had been the true linchpin of the D-Day landings. The war had not just been fought on the beaches, but in the briefing rooms and back channels, a silent, desperate struggle between tradition and innovation, between pride and pragmatism. He had not been a heretic cast into the wilderness. He had been the unwitting author of the single most important sentence in a document that saved thousands of lives. The final, declassified picture of D-Day wasn't just about a boat. It was about an idea. And the idea was this: in the new, total warfare of the 20th century, victory didn't always belong to the side with the strongest, most perfect weapon. Victory often belonged to the side that could best harness the relentless, overwhelming logic of mass production. Think of the Atlantic Wall not as a fortress, but as a single, infinitely powerful locked door. The British Admiralty, with centuries of tradition behind them, saw this door and concluded that the only way to get through was to build the world's most perfect, powerful, and expensive battering ram. Their steel LCAs were those rams, beautifully engineered, strong, but slow and few in number. Their plan was to slam these rams against the door, hoping its strength would prevail. Andrew Higgins, the loudmouth boat builder from New Orleans, never even saw the door. He was a locksmith. He wasn't interested in breaking the door down, he was interested in the shape of the keyhole. The keyhole was the few inches of water between the sandbars and the shore. So he designed a key. Not a beautiful, ornate key, but a cheap, disposable, mass-produced one, stamped out of plywood and steel by the thousands. What Davies and Pike did was smuggle the blueprint for that key into the high command. And what Eisenhower did was realize that the battle for Normandy wouldn't be won by one perfect battering ram, but by a flood of 10,000 cheap keys. He understood that even if the Germans could break 9 out of 10 keys, the 1,000 that got through would unlock the door and the whole fortress would fall. That is the beautiful, terrible aha moment of the Higgins boat. It explains everything. It explains the Admiralty's blind fury, the fury of master swordsmiths being told their exquisite blades were being replaced by 1 million mass-produced spears. It explains the horrifying losses at Omaha, the price of throwing fragile keys against a hardened lock. And it explains the ultimate success of the landing, the triumph of quantity over quality, of logistics over tactics. D-Day was not the victory of a superior weapon. It was the victory of a superior manufacturing philosophy. The echoes of that plywood arc still resonate today. It stands as a testament to the fact that sometimes the most profound military revolutions don't come from generals in grand headquarters, but from civilian innovators with muddy boots, who are simply trying to solve a practical problem. It is a story about the life-saving power of a good idea and the deadly inertia of a closed mind. The ultimate lesson of the Higgins boat is etched into every military operation that followed. It is a stark reminder that the fog of war is thickest in the minds of those who are certain they already know the way. And sometimes, The only thing that can cut through that fog is a heretical truth, delivered in an unarmored plywood box.